Hey everybody, in this video I want to discuss removing a bearing wall or installing a structural beam or maybe a header. Installing a structural framing beam or header, it's a crucial task in construction, and it supports the weight of the structure above, openings such as say doors and windows and rooms for that matter. So here's a step-by-step guide on how we retrofit structural framing beams in walls. You first need to determine if your wall is load bearing. To determine if a wall is load bearing, it's best to remove the drywall, inspect the framing. Oftentimes the attic or basement floor framing, if exposed, can give you the information to figure this out. A load bearing wall will almost always have a ceiling or floor framing running perpendicular overlapping it. Beams, columns, headers, and posts below the area that you're removing or putting your beam in are also great clues. If you're unsure, seek the guidance of a structural engineer. So let's talk about getting started and maybe talking with an engineer. Sometimes a full-service lumberyard will perform beam calculations that you need, as long as you buy the beam from them. In some cases, you may need to enlarge or add to existing footings to support and handle the additional weight and point load beneath the beam that you're doing. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. You want to ensure that the new beam is properly sized and designed for the load that it's going to carry. It's going to transfer the weight down on either side. The beam size depends on factors such as span, the load it's carrying, and the type of material that you're using. Today's typical beams can either be wood or engineered lumber, even steel. The code book can be used to size wood beams, but we always use a structural engineer to provide the necessary calculations and specifications if this is a big beam. Especially when you're installing beams at several locations throughout a house remodel. You want to make sure you're not going to hurt the integrity. I will note that for our project, we also located our original framing plans for the house, and we provided them to the structural engineer to use, and he thought it was very helpful. In addition, he then performed a site visit before and after demolition to assess the structure. He then provided us with a stamped plan for our installation, which is important for a building permit. Sometimes the structural engineer wants to see that. As far as setting our area up, prior to starting, we clear out all the area, install dust protection, protect the floors from damage from masonite and cardboard, builder's board type of material. We then remove any existing drywall, plaster, or other coverings to expose the framing where the beam is going to be installed. Then you got to deal with plumbing and wires, because wires, pipes, ductwork are most likely going to have to be relocated if they're in the way. You should expect to see wires running through the area that you're going to work on, so don't let that be a surprise for you. If we're installing a beam in a finished home, we typically snap a line 3 feet back on either side of the wall we're removing. We then use a Makita drywall cutter and just cut the drywall, nice straight line. Having the ceiling exposed allows us to see the framing, relocate utilities, as well as put up temporary walls. And depending on your situation, you may need to put up temporary supports, walls on either side. These temporary supports, they should be located on both sides if you have overlapping joists or whatever. Sometimes you don't need to if you've got a different orientation of joists, maybe they change direction or something like that. I will say, take your time with your temporary wall, double check, make sure everything is supported. I want to make note that if you have a posted ridge beam up in the attic, or a load-bearing wall or something above, you'll want to make sure that you have a second pair of temporary walls above, transferring weight to your lower temporary walls. Otherwise, your upper load-bearing wall will be supported only by the flooring, and that sometimes can be problematic if you're cutting a section like a beam pocket out, so you want to make sure you support that. Sometimes the floors below will also need bracing. I've seen that in some remodelings where they lack support. You just got to make sure you have support all the way down. Here's a pro tip. When you're building your temporary support wall, plan an opening through it to get your beam through and into your working space to get it up in place. This may involve framing your temporary wall with a 48-inch opening and maybe even a support header above it, probably a header because you want to carry that load across. This is especially important if you have a long beam or you're using a hydraulic beam lift or need access space for that matter. Okay, Ensuring support under your beam, so point loading. Confirm the walls, foundation below are lined up to support your new posts that are carrying a new beam. Your new point load on each end of that beam. I often use an insulation rod chucked into my cordless drill, and I drill down in the center of my beam location to locate where that is, and from there I can measure left and right to figure my jack studs where they're going to come down to the beam and figure that point load. When replacing a load-bearing wall with a beam, you need to create these new load-bearing points. So you need to ensure that the new beam support posts transfer the weight from your beam all the way down to the foundation, which might require additional support posts below or something blocking. Sometimes the beam support posts line up with the foundation wall or a house beam below, and you're lucky. In these situations, you need to install solid blocking between the floor and the beam so that that point load transfers to the beam. These solid blocking that come down transfers the load from the new support post that you just installed under your beam or header down to your older house beam or foundation wall. In the case of a post landing on a main house beam, you still may want to install a new support column and a concrete footing. Depends. These calculations, they are best done by a structural engineer. It's above my pay grade. This work should be done prior to the beam installation, especially if you're going to be pouring a new footing, a 3,500 PSI footing. In this case, you'll need to allow your footing to cure at least 7 days before placing a load on it, probably much longer. Okay, let's talk about removing the existing framing and preparing to install the beam. So once your temporary wall shoring is in place, we can cut and remove any of the wall studs that are in our way, right? Get them out of your way. Sometimes I might choose to reuse some of the existing wall studs. If so, I might use them for jacks or something. If so, I just take measures and make sure I cut clean, precise cuts. When you're cutting the wall out, you should expect some load bearing on your temporary walls as well when you're removing that. So just be aware of that. If you're installing a flush beam, you will need to cut the floor joists as well as take the wall out below. And that's called creating a beam pocket, cutting the floor joists on either side. I use a laser, snap some lines. I cut the pocket 3/8 larger so that I don't have to fight the beam or get stuck putting it in place. And once the beam is in place, the joist is then connected to the beam with joist hangers. One tip for you guys is after cutting the beam pocket, clean up stray nails and make room for the beam, right? So we use end nippers, but most of the time a multi-tool with a really good carbide metal blade cuts through those nail screws like nothing. Cut the new beam to the correct length, prepare any bracing and temporary supports, have everything ready for when you need it, and then once you're ready, start putting it in. Now for steel beams, you may want to pack your beam with wood. It's best to order the beam so that the packing bolt holes are in between your joist bays, so they're not in the way of your joist hangers. For more information on that, check out our how to install a flush steel beam video that we did. It's a great video. Okay, when we're building, say, a wood or LVL beam, typically we might install one LVL at a time. And if we're installing a flush LVL, we direct nail the very first one into the joists and then build off of that. If you do this, ensure that the bottom of the joist line up with your beam before you nail it off. A laser, levels, string can all help with this. We then add and fasten the additional LVLs, sandwiching them, fastening them all together once they're in place. When lifting the beam into place, you may need additional help, such as 2x cradles, braces, or mechanical lifting equipment. Sometimes I use a hydraulic jack, and that's due to the beam's weight. It's also sometimes you need to get a little level or get it up and tighter. You want to ensure the beam is level if you can, and it fits snugly in place. Adjust as necessary before you put your final pieces in. And this might require some slight jacking to level or shimming or whatever you need. Now, depending on the specific situation, if the beam is large or span is long, you may need to use additional, something stronger like 4x4, 4x6, 6x6, PSL posts, or even steel. We cut our PSL or wood support posts an 1/8 inch long and then gently drive them in place. You typically tip the bottom into the pocket and then drive the post in place along the top of the beam's edge. Just drive it right in. It should not take a lot of force to drive these in place. If it does, remeasure and recut. You don't want to be driving the beam too high. We use a sledgehammer, tap them in place, or a jack a little bit higher and get it in, or whatever the situation allows. We fasten the LVL beams to each other using structural ply screws, following the structural engineer or the manufacturer fastener recommendations. We also attach the beam to the existing framing using structural ply lags, screws, or appropriate fasteners, whatever the situation calls for. Depending on that situation, you may need to install metal connections or even weld a support to a steel post or something like that. You want to ensure that your supports and connections are installed, secure, and meet engineer specifications. Let's address joist hangers. Prior to installing the joist hangers, we use a hydraulic jack to raise any of the low joists, get them to the bottom of the beam or get them all in the same line flush. Number 10 joist hanger nails are used to fasten our 2x10 Simpson joist hangers to the beam. Using a positive placement pneumatic nailer makes this easy and efficient. There's cordless ones now too. 2x10 joist hangers have diagonal holes going in two on each side. It's for double shear nailing. This locks the joist to the beam and prevents pullout. Longer fasteners are required for double shear nailing. We use 16D penny nails, or we use structural screws designed for this purpose. Simpson makes an ST connector screw that's 2.5 or 3 inches long that you can use. I will note that you want to fill all of your joist hanger fastener holes, and you want to use the appropriate fasteners. Now, prior to removing your temporary supports, you want to gradually remove them, ensuring that the beam and the structure are safe and stable. Finish the installation by replacing drywall, plaster, or other finishes, insulation, whatever you need to do, right? If you'd like to see how we installed that flush beam that I talked about, watch our video replacing a load-bearing steel beam at the end of this video. It's kind of cool. It's a little bit more in-depth than this one, and it shows the steel beam, which is kind of fun. I'm Rob Robillard. We'll see you at the next video. Take care.